Chair now recognizes Representative Massie for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. The home builders in my district, the people who are providing services to the homes, like the sewer districts, they all understand that there has to be some regulation, and they don't want to pollute. But the two things that I hear from them and all of my constituents is that we need to improve clarity and reduce disparity, because they can deal with these. These are costs of doing business. They get passed on to the consumer, so we should strive to minimize them while taking care of the environment. But the problem is, if you don't have clarity on, like you were talking about the maps, the lack of maps from prior administrations, they're shooting in the dark. And then if they get treated one way on one project and then they go to another project in a different state or a different district, they're treated another way. And these create uncertainty and hardships, not just for those providers, but for the customers. So, the former EPA administrator said that their rule was based on science. Yet when I looked at the rule, there were no units of measure, there were no numbers. Like, it was words like moderate flow, heavy flow, intermittent. These things need to be defined in order to improve the clarity and reduce the disparity. Some of my constituents, and I know some of these issues are Army Corps issues, and maybe that's one of the problems we have here. There are a couple silos, but one of the recommendations that I've heard from my district, where there's a consent decree, they're under a consent decree that's going to cost the sewer district, which will be passed on to the ratepayers, hundreds of millions of dollars. One of the questions they asked is, and this is what the developers are asking too, all of this money that the developers are paying in to the mitigation banks, which frankly some of it goes to some dubious projects. If you go inspect these projects, it's not clear whether they've improved the environment or the condition of a stream or not. And some of it just goes into buying rural land and locking it up forever from development, which exacerbates rural poverty. When they're trying to save the environment by buying up land in rural counties, it creates hardships for those counties. And it takes stuff off the tax rolls. So here's what they've recommended to me, and I said, this idea will never catch on in DC because it makes too much sense. It's common sense, which this is what they want to do. Take the money that the developers are paying in mitigation fees when they build homes for new home buyers and use it for the consent decree to actually use the money, the mitigation money, okay? Ostensibly, the developers are having an impact on the environment. Instead of spending that money on projects we're not quite sure, it's hard to prove they improve the environment, why don't we spend it on the neediest projects, which are these sewer overflows that are in the district? Like, what do you think of that idea? I know it's gonna sound crazy to everybody here because it makes sense everywhere else, but.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So from a high level, in fact, in former position in the state is, I believe that you should apply your resources where you get the best economic and environmental value, and more importantly, the environmental public health protection value. And so that's one of the reasons why we're taking a look at updating and modernizing our mitigation policies. For example, in my water quality trading policy that we developed in February, one of the 6 core principles is encouraging multi-use banks. So not just for wetland mitigation or water quality trading, but also species conservation. So that we work with our federal partners to take a look at landscape scale conservation and bring multiple sources of revenue to provide a higher level ecological lift for whatever bank that you're talking about. We're updating working with the Corps of Engineers. We've worked really hard to break down the silos between those federal agencies and have a great working relationship with them. We're updating our compensatory mitigation rule with the Corps taking the lead on that. We're working with the Corps on things like if you're taking out a check dam to try to repair riparian corridor and there's a little bit of fringe habitat around a pond behind the check dam, there was a disincentive to do the check dam removal and repair the stream, because if you had to compensate or offset the impact of the fringe wetland on the pond, it may make it economically unviable. And so we're working with the Corps to modernize those types of mitigation policies. So So at a high level, I agree with you that we need to be more creative in how we use our mitigation and get the best bang for the buck.
And one of the mitigations I would recommend that they be more flexible in granting, because it's fallen out of favor recently, is allowing the developer to mitigate on the property there locally. Like, what can you do to improve things there locally where people will see the benefit instead of putting it into this black hole where you're not sure what the money's being spent on? It's actually more efficient that way, I think.
Time has expired, but the witness can answer the question.
Yeah, that's a historic question. You know, back in the day, it was on-site, and we found that if you didn't have the sophistication to operate and manage the wetland, for example, wetland mitigation going forward, 10, 15 years later, you may have had a decline in the resource. And so there has to be some balance between the sophistication of the entity who manages the resource going forward. Sometimes it's a local landowner, but sometimes not.
Thank you, Mr. Massie.